Hi, all. We're going to give people a few more minutes to filter in. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Automatic SIP Trunking and Peering Working Group session here at IETF 111. Here is the note well. Please note well. I'm sure you've seen this go by once or twice already this week, but please pay attention. Thanks. So some info here on how the meeting is going to run. So any decisions made will be confirmed on the mailing list. If, since you're attending, you already have registration and a data tracker login. This meeting is being recorded. Please use headphones when speaking. And please remember to state your full name when you're granted your spot in the queue. So the blue sheets are automatically tracked by MeetEcho, so no worries there. So if you would like to ask questions, make statements, please enter the queue by clicking the little hand icon. I will acknowledge you, and then you turn on your audio and your video to speak. And then when you're done, you shut that down, and the next person can join. All right, and we will be presenting the slides. I will be doing the slides, and my co-chair Gonzalo will be monitoring the Jabber Room. So, Jabber Room, also handled by MeetEcho. So, minutes. I understand that we have minute takers. Mark and Custub, appreciate it.
I just want to confirm, is that okay with both of you guys?
Yeah, that's good with me. This is custom.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Mark, thank you.
And here is our agenda. We have already taken care of the note well, note takers. We are here at the agenda that we could bash if we want. We have one presentation for our one working group document. Document has been updated and the authors will be presenting that and also pointing out open questions. And then we have wrap up and next steps. Anybody care to bash the agenda? All right, see nobody jumping into the queue. All right, let me load the next slide deck then. All right, Srikanth, take it away.
Hey, thank you, John. You're able to hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, hey everyone, thank you for joining this session. My name is Srikanth. I'm going to be taking you through the automatic zip trunking and peering effort. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the agenda for our discussion today. Just a high-level refresher, and then I'm going to talk about the additions to the latest draft, and we're just going to discuss some open items once I go through the slides. Next slide, please. Yeah. All right. So for those who are, for the benefit of those who've not attended an ASAP meeting before, and those who haven't had the time to go through the draft yet, I just wanted to do a quick high-level overview. So the goal of this solution is to just give a simple and straightforward way for administrators to provision SIP trunks with a service provider. Traditionally, what we've observed is while administrators are configuring these SIP trunks on their SBCs, they face issues and troubleshoot those issues, which often takes them into a territory where they do trial and error and they troubleshoot for a few days in order to reach a working solution. So we really want to attack that problem and make it a much smoother process where a capability set document is provided by the service provider. The capability set document is a document that contains all of the basic parameters that are required by the SBC to establish the SIP trunk with the service provider and get calls working as soon as possible. So it uses HTTPS as the framework in order to get, challenge, and receive the document from the service provider. And once the document is received by the SBC, it can parse that. And this can be an automated process. It can parse it and configure itself, or an administrator can manually parse that document and configure the SBC and get calls working. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the additions to the latest draft first. Next slide. Right. So the first thing that we've added to the latest draft is the identification of the request target, which is the location of the capability set server. So today, there are two ways this information can be handed down to the enterprise. One way is the out-of-band method using an email by the service provider, mentioning where the SIP, capability server is located. The other way is where this information is not provided by the service provider beforehand, and it can be instead discovered using WebFinger. So the enterprise network can target a WebFinger query to the SIP service provider domain. And in one of the responses from the link array, the service provider can indicate that the capability set document is located at a particular URL, which when re-referenced by the enterprise, they acquire the capability set. So I'll be talking a little more about this in the open items section, because we are thinking about defining a new link relation type for this. Next slide, please. Another section that we've added in the latest draft is a section on STIR. This is because STIR is mandatory now, and we do see service providers adopting this gradually. So we've added 3 nodes as part of the capability set document. The first node basically indicates whether the SIP service provider is STIR compliant. Now, peering with the STIR compliant SIP provider has ramifications on both incoming and outgoing calls for the enterprise. If you take the case of an outgoing call, if the service provider is STIR compliant, the enterprise has to take more care in making sure that the calling number is correctly represented. This can be in the PA asserted identity header, or the ID header, the remote party ID, or the from header. So that becomes important for the enterprise. If you look at incoming calls as well, let's say the enterprise is providing a verification service before passing the call on downstream. In that case, it becomes really important for this enterprise to know that, yes, the service provider is supporting STIR, and so it can do its own verification of the calling party before it passes the call further. The second node indicates whether the SIP service provider is willing to delegate authority over one or more number ranges that it owns. The use cases for this are documented in the STIR delegate certificate draft. So there's a good reason to do this. And if the service provider is willing to delegate this authority, the third node is also present, which indicates the Acme directory URL object, which the enterprise can dereference in order to obtain delegate certificates. Now, there's one assumption that we've made, that the Acme client for the enterprise network is already pre-authorized. This is so that when it does place an order for a delegate certificate, it receives an empty challenge array, so it doesn't get challenged in any form by the service provider. Next slide, please. Apart from this, we've just had a few minor modifications. We added a section on what the SBC can do once it receives the capability set response from the service provider. And we've reordered a few sections for better readability and made some formatting changes. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's talk about some of the open items that we have. Next slide, please. Right, so the first open item is the WebFinger link relation type, which I mentioned in the WebFinger slide. So on the right, you can see a GET request that might be sent by the enterprise SBC in order to discover the capability set document location on the service provider domain. Now, traditionally, if a general query is sent, we would get a links array with a lot of information in it. It could have information about documentation on licensing, SLAs, customer support, FAQs, pricing, and a lot of information that is basically not relevant for the SBC, right? The only information that the SBC is looking for is a URL that it can dereference to get the capability set document. So we think it makes sense to define a new link relation type called capability set, so that the SBC can then place a very specific GET request using WebFinger for the capability set only. And when the service provider responds, it'll provide, in the links array, it'll only provide the location of the capability set document. Next slide, please. Right. The next one is to have a section that allows service providers to communicate any changes that they undergo in their networks, right? While this is a rare occurrence, it can happen. And if it does happen, how does the service provider inform the enterprise about this? So this can be done using the help of a revision section in the document where the service provider provides a location for the new capability set, as well as when that capability set is going to become active, when that change is going to become active. This is so that the enterprise can make those changes and expect the change to happen at a particular time, rather than having to face call failures and then adopting the change in a reactive manner. Next slide, please. And then we have a couple of minor open items. One is to discuss whether any additional parameters can be added for stir or shaken, apart from the 3 that I spoke about. And how do we represent the capability set document? Should it be an XML document or should it be a JSON document? So that's the other open item. Next slide. I think we're at the end of the slides right now. So I think now we can have the discussion. I just want to get through the slides so that we could have a discussion about the open items. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. John.
Hey, how's it going, man? Good to see the stir stuff coming through in this. Always very interested to see these kinds of things. I know there has been a lot of discussion actually about the provisioning systems that are related to stir, in particular from both kind of service provider to vendors that do authentication and verification services as a service, right? As well as like potentially enterprise to service provider. I think there is an interest in getting some more standardization around some of those APIs. And like, there are a couple of APIs that are in use for this. Like, for example, the HTTP API that an enterprise or service provider uses to actually get a SIP request signed and get back, a passport from these services or get back a validation from these services. But then there's another category that really is much more like provisioning, where there's like a set of data that is about, for this kind of numbers, we want to sign this way with this level of attestation, and like kind of like pre-provisioning for that. And if you're interested, I mean, we'd probably take it to the list, but there is like a bunch of things like that that could potentially be added on to the things that you're already incorporating into this. So definitely interested to see more standardization around that.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. To get that information as well. Yeah, we can definitely have a discussion on the list regarding this. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Jonathan?
Hey guys, thanks for the update. Also happy to see some stuff on stir. I'm personally going through this pain right now in configuring and working with carriers on SIP trunks and stir support. I have a bunch of comments on what isn't here. First thing I'll say is the sort of, you have a flag called stir compliance, right? Which is Boolean on whether the carrier is compliant or not. This Boolean is a tautology because at least in the United States, as of June 30, 2021, every single carrier will return a 1 because they're all supposed to be stir compliant. So I'm not sure this really says very much. To me, the more interesting things are what the expectations are around passports in and out. For example, one of the use cases I've bumped into that I would love to see documented here is this question of whether, in our case, we're a contact center provider, we send calls to carriers, will they accept our passports if we put a passport in then and pass them through, and or not, and are they verifying that the numbers we're using are part of their range that is supposed to be allocated to us or not at this time, or are they just sort of authenticating that we are who we say or are not checking the numbers yet. So those are things that we've had to go and manually obtain from our on our SIP trunks, that if we had a way to get those 2 bits, at least those would be super useful. I'm less optimistic on actually getting certificates through this thing. So I think the cert delegation one to me is less useful, but certainly like understanding the current state of enforcement for calls going into a carrier using bits here would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Chris.
Can you hear me? I heard my echo, so I guess the answer is here.
So you're
Yes.
pretty light, Chris.
Yeah, I'm getting a big echo. Let me try to dial back in.
Okay, while we wait for Chris, John?
Sure. So just to the question of, yeah, I mean, the how this interacts with Acme and things like it. You know, I mean, I think Acme, especially for enterprises, is still largely aspirational in the sense that, you know, I'm not aware that there are a lot of carriers that are already using like authority token mechanisms to do delegation or something like it. And there's just so much administrative stuff that comes along with getting a number range. Like, you know, I think if we had something that was like ordering a number range through this, basically, like, yeah, I mean, I think there are parts of that that are going to remain out of band. So I think Jonathan's probably right about that like, you know, having a way to track that you have a mutual understanding of what numbers have been allocated, and, you know, that there's some positive feedback you get from the interface about that just for debugging or whatever would be super useful. But, you know, I would like to see a world where number allocation is extremely dynamic like that, but I don't think we're going to get there in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, John. So Chris, are you back? Oh, Jonathan.
Yeah, so to follow up with what John said while we wait for Chris, VoIP is hard. You know, I'm sure he's blocked because of stir or something. So I think to me, the interesting thing to signal at a high level is, you know, there's still is variability on what carrier policy is on both the ingress and egress side for stir, because the law doesn't mandate all behaviors. Whatever those variabilities are, that's the kind of stuff that would be useful to encode in bits. Would be my general guidance on this thing. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Chris.
Okay, hopefully this is better.
Yes.
My comment is along the lines of what John Peterson said. I agree about the interface for, you know, stir shaken and having some standardization there. I obviously am interested in this delegated cert stuff as well. My question is more along the lines of support for trunking versus the shaken as a service type of thing versus peering. I see a lot of variations of those things, and I wonder, is this document focused on one of those, multiple of those? Is that scope of the charter? That's more maybe like a bigger question, but I'd be curious what the intention is to cover all those things, or cover a small scope, or because I think there will be a need for a lot of those things going forward.
Thank you. Cullen.
So I was just going to make the comment. It's about the provisioning of numbers. That I agree. This doesn't seem like a mechanism that's really good for being able to request new numbers and get them. That's a very, very deeply tied with all kinds of other things in billing. But I do think there is value in the service provider being able to report to the device, these are the numbers that I think is allocated to this customer that I would expect to see across this trunk. That might help or it might not, but I think that that's a much lesser goal than anything of being able to try and figure out what numbers are there, but just report down what the information is.
Thank you. Kostep.
So sorry about that. So just basically 2 points that I wanted to make. The first one is, so the scope of this work, at least as it started out, was to make kind of SIP trunking smooth between enterprise and service providers, SIP service providers specifically. I do understand that the landscape has changed slightly over the last couple of months, specifically with a lot of as-a-service paradigms, including STIR as a service or verification as a service. I would say that at least at this point in time, the scope of work is essentially to get whatever it is that the service provider likes, doesn't like, supports, doesn't support, and kind of use that information in order to bring up the SIP trunk. But we can certainly kind of see and discuss, whether some of the as-a-service paradigms kind of could be incorporated within the scope. And the second point that I wanted to bring up is there already is a field, I believe, within the capability set. I'm sorry, I don't recall the name, wherein the service provider can communicate to the enterprise what exactly is the number block or the number ranges that have been allocated. So I think that would serve as a viable mechanism, if at all, when calls are being sent out to present the appropriate caller identity.
Thank you. Chris?
I guess my concern is that I think there's not a ton of overlap with those applications, so I'd probably rather see different specs to address each of those. Just my personal preference.
Thank you. Any Kostep?
Forgot to kind of move myself out of the queue. Sorry.
Ah, all right. Any other comments, questions? Gonzalo? We're not hearing you.
Are you able to hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay. So this is just as a participant. So I wanted to dredge up something from the past that I think we had at the last meeting, and it's kind of a follow-up for Jonathan. He had mentioned that there was potentially some overlap or at least some conflicts that needed to be resolved with his high availability draft. I'm assuming that's still the case, but I just wanted to see what his take was on that and kind of the plan going forward for that, so we can make sure that we kind of account for that work.
Yeah, I have not looked at it again since I last minute the draft, to be honest, but I think that's still the case. So yeah, still have to do that.
Cool. Thanks, Jonathan.
Kostep?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to kind of, ask the group about, the general thought, the general opinion about some of the open items that were discussed, specifically around, if at all there's a need to register a new link relation type for WebFinger queries, and whether there is any kind of opinion on whether the group favors XML over JSON or vice versa. Just wanted an opinion on that. I think that would be helpful.
Does anyone have any opinions on those topics? Some of the questions have been outstanding for a while, like the XML versus JSON. Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this one of those, like, flip a coin or support both, or whatever. I mean, it doesn't. JSON. I vote for JSON. Coming close to the open issue.
Or
I'm serious. Like, I mean, like, just pick something. It's not how
Cullen.
coding works.
Please don't pick two things. Pick one. I second Jonathan's proposal. Or any other proposal. Just one, though.
Just pick one. All right. Anyone else? And I do understand, having only using one. I myself, as an individual, don't have a strong preference for one versus the other. So how would the working group feel if the authors went with JSON? I could even do a show of hands. Let me... Here, I'll start a session. Anybody for JSON? So out of about the 20 participants in the working group session, we've had 10 join in on the show of hands. I'll be ending the session unless other people want to jump in with their opinion. All right. Well, JSON looks to be fairly popular. Sounds like perhaps we can just go with that. We will confirm that on the list, update the document. I'm reading the Jabber chat room. So, all right, another vote for JSON. So how about WebFinger and the new link relation there? How shall I phrase that question for the show of hands tool? Gonzalo?
Cost-up Shrikant, this is really a question for you guys. What exactly is it that you guys want to get kind of sort of final decisions made for? Let's get that on the table and see if we can phrase it as clearly as possible for the working group to answer.
Yeah, so the kind of the guidance they were looking for is specifically in scenarios wherein an administrator does not really know which HTTPS URL to pull in order to get the capabilities. Now, in those situations, and in trying to make this as much of an automated framework as as possible. I think WebFinger kind of fits well into that paradigm, and for WebFinger to be truly effective, as Shrikant mentioned in one of his slides, we could have a scenario wherein we target a WebFinger query to, let's say, a service provider domain, and the WebFinger response could potentially have, a link relations array with a ton of objects, most of which obviously would not be relevant to obtaining the capability set. So in order to lend it better to automation, and in order to make it more streamlined, we were of the opinion that it would perhaps make sense in order to define a new link relation that's specific to the ASAP effort. It could be named whatever, the name is not important. It could be named capability set or anything else, but insofar as making this more streamlined and making it easier for administrators, we thought that this would be a useful addition. So we just wanted to understand whether it makes sense, or whether the group thinks it makes sense for us to kind of, look at the option of registering a new link creation type in IANA.
Gonzalo?
Yeah, I think that's the question, Gene, is essentially is, do we want to register a new link relation for this?
All right.
So we can do show of hands. I mean, we can certainly have some discussion about it. Obviously, I'm going to be pro WebFinger, having been a co-author. So, but yeah, maybe we raise some hands around that.
All right.
Are we just all
Okay.
quiet, or is some audio
Oh,
get lost?
no, I was going to give it a few more moments because only 5 participants played, so fewer than the JSON question. But well, go ahead. I see no objections here, I guess. So, is there anything else that we should throw to a show of hands here? Jonathan?
Yeah, I don't know if it's throwing to show of hands, but I wanted to raise one other issue that sort of pops out to me, especially after the STIR discussion. If we're starting to use this protocol to provide an enterprise the set of phone numbers that the service provider thinks that that enterprise is supposed to be using, it dramatically changes the security properties of this thing, right? Minus that, most of the rest of this is pretty generic config that you can argue doesn't even need authentication. It's just like static property files that would be identical for configuring any enterprise really to connect to the trunk. But my phone number list is super, super critical. The document sort of weighs its hand, honestly, on the whole authentication question. And if the idea is like, somehow I'm going to implement this in an SPC on the enterprise side, and I can just, type in a credential or do something, and this works with the carrier, like you probably need to say a little bit more than out of scope. Like we will not get an interoperable solution, and authentication will be required to provide this data. So I guess my question is, do we need to specify the technique for authentication in order to get an interoperable solution, or do we sort of like leave it vague, or basically get rid of the need for authentication by removing anything that can be considered non-public information. Other opinions on this?
Those are very good points. Anyone else have anything to follow on that comment?
I mean, I'll just add that that's weird. I didn't seem to be doing video. I don't know. Anyway, it seems broken here. I was going to add that I just personally favor towards simplicity over anything else. So if it meant losing that functionality of knowing the numbers versus adding a complex authentication system, and I think I go more towards the other way of just not requiring this to be authenticated. But I don't know what I mean. I can easily live with either. But I would lean towards simplicity, and I totally agree with Jonathan that it's a problem to have have numbers without authentication is not going to work.
Any other thoughts? Custom?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with what Cullen just said. I mean, the entire purpose of this effort was to make stuff, simple and to kind of get SIPRUNCs configured quickly. But one thing that I would hate for us to find ourselves in, a couple of months or years down the line is to have to find this framework being useless in the context of that time. So if we have to add stuff that's specific to the number ranges that are allocated to an enterprise, I think we ought to do that with an explicit mechanism for authentication that's mentioned within the draft, as opposed to leaving it vague. So the idea is, of course, to make it simple, to make stuff work better insofar as SIP trunking is concerned, but also at the same time, I think this effort or this framework should kind of be relevant for some time to come. So that's my opinion.
Thank you.
If we wanted to specify something, oh, sorry, echo. If we want to specify, to me, I like the thing I would not do is I would not leave it vague, nor would I say like let's use digest. That's not a. I suspect you'd want to basically say the service provider has to implement it, all off, and the user would log in, the client device, SBC or whatever, would have to render a web page that allows user to kick off the process via a login page or what have you, and then it uses the resulting access token. That would be if we wanted to do any authentication. That's what I would suggest we say, something along those lines. Either that or remove the numbers. I lean slightly to just, it's not hard to specify that that's what should happen. The issue is largely on whether or not people want to implement that. I don't know, like if we have any SBC vendors in here, well, I guess Cisco is here, but like, it's not necessarily trivial to go do this in implementation. If it's a barrier, then that might be a problem.
Custom?
Getting to move myself out of the queue. I'm really sorry.
Oh, no problem. So anybody want to speak to the implementation of an authentication mechanism here? Shrikant.
Yeah, hey. So actually, we did have OAuth in an earlier version of the draft as one of the authentication mechanisms. But yeah, again, that is something that we thought might be very complicated to implement in the real world. So I think, yeah, this is, I think definitely something for us to think about, weighing whether having the numbers and versus the implementation of the authentication mechanism. Yeah, I think that's something that we will look at addressing.
Thank you. So I'm thinking perhaps maybe more discussion on the list on that. I'm not sure that a show of hands right now at this moment would be helpful. Somebody let me know if that's not the case. Happy to ask people if they want the authentication mechanism so they can have number ranges, or if they want something simpler and something out more quickly. Taking a look at the Jabber room here. So nothing current on that. Well, I think we've had a good discussion. Is there any other topic anyone wants to bring up? I think we'll take the discussion of the authentication to the list and confirm on the list the WebFinger and the new link relation and the use of JSON. Going once, going twice. Well, thank you, everyone. And we will catch up on the mailing list. Kostov.
No, I just wanted to thank everybody.
Shrikant?
Yeah, same here. Thanks. Thanks a lot to everyone for this good discussion, and we'll take all the pending items on the mailing list, and yeah, let's see where we go from there. Thank you.
And
Have a
thank
nice
you.
Thanks, everyone.